Mercy, that stayed after the funeral, a modern retelling inspired by Dorcas and the woman bent over for 18 years. Written by Susanna Sunday, there are some stories the world does not know how to tell properly. Stories about disability, stories about long illness, stories about carers growing old beside suffering, stories about children who never became independent, stories about adults whose bodies bent slowly under pain while life continued around them, stories about families who loved deeply, carried faithfully, buried quietly, and still woke up the next morning trying to continue living. And often, when someone living with disability or long-term illness dies, people say one sentence quickly: at least they are no longer suffering. Sometimes it is true, but sometimes those left behind feel guilty because their grief is more complicated than relief, because the person who suffered was also beloved, funny, difficult, holy, exhausting, precious, deeply woven into the life of the house. And when they leave, silence enters places nobody prepared for. This is the story of mercy after long suffering, mercy after funerals, mercy after caregiving, mercy for those still living, and mercy for those whose bodies carried burdens from many years. Chapter 1. The woman who bent slowly. Her name was Evelyn. At first it was only back pain, then stiffness, then fatigue, then years. Doctors tried, medication helped briefly, then less. By 62, Evelyn no longer walked upright comfortably. Her spine curved severely. Chronic illness had slowly bent her body downward until pain shaped nearly every movement. People spoke to her differently now, some with pity, some impatiently, some loudly, as though physical weakness meant intellectual weakness too. But Evelyn remained gentle and useful. That was what surprised people, because suffering had not emptied her kindness. Like Dorcas in scripture, she quietly spent her life helping others. When neighbors lost jobs, Evelyn cooked. When single mothers struggled, she knitted blankets for babies. When children with disabilities needed sensory items, she sewed soft-weighted lap pads with aching hands. Her tiny flat became a sanctuary for tired people, not because she was physically strong, but because mercy lived in her spirit. Chapter 2. Dorcas in the estate block. In Acts chapter 9, Dorcas was full of good works and alms deeds. When she died, widows gathered around Peter, weeping and showing him the coats and garments she had made while she was alive. That detail matters deeply, because love leaves evidence. Not always large evidence, sometimes stitched blankets, text messages, meals, lifts to appointments, calming words, sitting beside hospital beds, helping exhausted mothers, understanding disabled children without judgment. Evelyn had become that kind of woman. The carers knew her. The autistic teenagers trusted her. The wheelchair users relaxed around her because she never rushed them. The mothers cried in her kitchen. The fathers spoke honestly in her presence. She herself lived, bent over by illness. Yet she kept lifting others. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share mercy daily with every family carrying long suffering. Chapter 3. The families she held together. One of the families Evelyn loved most was the Johnson family. Their son, Micah, was 20 and profoundly disabled, tube-fed, non-speaking, seizure-prone, fully dependent for all care. His mother, Ruth, had not slept properly in years. People called her strong, but Ruth secretly hated that word because strength sounded voluntary, and much of caregiving is simply necessity wearing exhausted clothes. Ruth had become nurse, physiotherapist, feeding specialist, advocate, medication manager, behavioral interpreter, financial strategist, night watch woman. She loved Micah fiercely, but some days she felt herself disappearing. Evelyn understood this without explanation. She never offered simplistic advice. She simply came, sat, listened, sometimes folded laundry, silently, sometimes held Micah while Ruth showered. Tiny mercies. Holy mercies. Chapter 4. The children who did not stay long. Then there was Chloe, 9 years old. Blind from birth and living with a degenerative neurological condition, her parents had spent nearly a decade balancing hospital stays, specialist travel, interrupted schooling, financial pressure, fear and love large enough to break their own hearts repeatedly. Chloe died quietly one winter morning. Her mother found her peaceful, still, gone. The house changed shape after that. Silence became physical. Her wheelchair remained in the corner for months because nobody could bear moving it. Her father still woke at 5 in the morning automatically because his body remembered medication schedules even after death had ended them. Grief does not leave quickly from houses that have carried long suffering. Chapter 5. Mercy at the funeral. At Chloe's funeral, people struggled to know what to say. Some avoided mentioning her disability at all. Others spoke only of suffering. But Evelyn stood slowly with her bent spine and said something different. Chloe was not only illness, the room became still. She was joy, too. Then Evelyn described Chloe laughing at rain sounds, Chloe recognizing voices instantly, Chloe squeezing her mother's hand during worship songs, Chloe smiling when her father carried her, Chloe calming when her brother read stories aloud. And suddenly, the room remembered. This child had not merely been dying slowly. She had been living. Deeply. Fully. Differently, perhaps. But truly living. That too was mercy. Chapter 6. The woman bent over for 18 years. In Luke chapter 13, Jesus saw a woman who had been bent over for 18 years. 18 years, long enough for suffering to become ordinary to everyone around her, long enough for people to stop expecting change, long enough for limitation to become identity. Scripture says, "And he laid his hands on her, and immediately she was made straight." Luke chapter 13, verse 13. Many people read only the miracle, but the deeper mercy may begin earlier. Jesus saw her. In crowded places, disabled people often become invisible. People see wheelchairs before people, diagnoses before humanity, limitations before dignity. But Christ saw the woman herself. And Evelyn often thought, perhaps one of the greatest mercies for disabled people and exhausted carers is simply being truly seen. Chapter 7. The funeral that opened eyes. After Chloe's death, the support community changed. Not because suffering disappeared, but because people understood urgency differently now. Parents checked on one another more intentionally. Carers admitted exhaustion more honestly. Siblings were noticed more carefully. Churches started creating sensory-friendly spaces. A local teacher began a support program for students with hidden disabilities. One father who had always avoided discussing his depression finally asked for help. One exhausted mother accepted respite care for the first time. Mercy was still moving, even through grief. Especially through grief. Chapter 8. Evelyn's final winter. Then Evelyn herself became ill. More ill than usual. The woman who had held so many others together quietly began slipping away. The carers visited her now. The mothers brought soup. The autistic children she had loved came with handmade cards. Micah's mother sat beside her one evening, holding her fragile hand. "You carried all of us," Ruth whispered. Evelyn smiled faintly. "No," she said slowly. "Mercy carried me too." That was the truth. People often imagine carers, disabled people, and chronically ill believers surviving through extraordinary strength. But many survive through mercy. Daily mercy. The mercy of one more morning, one peaceful hour, one helpful neighbor, one calm body, one good nurse, one unexpected laugh, one manageable day, one prayer whispered through exhaustion. Chapter 9. The night she died. Evelyn died quietly in her sleep. No dramatic final speech, no cinematic moment, just peace. The women from the community gathered again like the widows around Dorcas, and just like in Acts, they brought evidence of her love. Blankets, notes, photographs, tiny stitched sensory toys, birthday cards she had written for disabled children, meals she had once delivered. One mother held up a weighted lap blanket Evelyn had sewn years earlier for her autistic son. "He still sleeps with this," she cried. The room wept together, because goodness leaves traces behind. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share mercy daily. Every family carrying long suffering needs to know they are not forgotten. Chapter 10. The miracle and the mercy. Dorcas was raised in Scripture. Not everyone is raised immediately in this life. That is one of the painful mysteries Christians still live with. Some receive dramatic healing here, others receive peace gradually, others die still carrying illness. And yet resurrection still remains central to Christianity. Not because Christians deny grief, but because Christ himself entered death and came through it alive, which means disability, suffering, disease, and death do not own the final sentence forever. That matters deeply to grieving families, especially those who spent years caregiving, especially those who watched bodies weaken slowly, especially those who loved someone whose suffering ended through death rather than visible, earthly healing. Chapter 11, The New Stage of Life. For those still living, new stages kept arriving. Micah grew older. His parents had to plan adulthood care, housing, legal arrangements, medical support, future protection, and that transition terrified them. But mercy was there too. People stepped forward, plans emerged, community formed. One family created a supported living initiative for disabled adults. Another began mentoring exhausted sibling carers. A church converted unused rooms into respite spaces. The suffering had not been meaningless. Mercy kept creating pathways forward. Chapter 12. The bent woman stood taller than people knew. At Evelyn's memorial service, Ruth spoke finely. She walked bent, she said, but she carried people upright. Everyone cried then, because some of the people carrying the heaviest pain become the greatest carriers of mercy. Not despite suffering, sometimes through it. Chapter 13. The mercy that remains after death. The hardest truth many families learn is this: mercy does not always prevent death. Sometimes mercy walks people through it, through funerals, through empty bedrooms, through silent wheelchairs, through untouched medication boxes, through grief anniversaries, through the strange quiet, after years of caregiving, suddenly stop. And still, God remains present, not hurried, not cruel, present. Closing reflection. This story is for families living with disability, carers, grieving parents, disabled adults, siblings carrying invisible burdens, families who buried loved ones after long illness, and those preparing new stages of life for those still living. The woman bent over for 18 years was seen by Christ. Dorcas was remembered through the mercy she gave others. And every disabled child, chronically ill adult, exhausted carer, grieving parent, and frightened sibling is also seen. Some stories end in earthly healing. Some end in quiet funerals. Some continue into new stages requiring courage nobody prepared for, but mercy remains in all of them. Mercy in caregiving hands, communities gathering, ordinary mornings, peaceful deaths, remembered love, practical help, future planning, and the promise that suffering does not own eternity. Because Christ himself entered suffering, carried grief, wept with mourners, touched bent bodies, raised the dead, and promised resurrection beyond the reach of disease. And so, even after funerals, mercy still sits in the room. His mercies are new every morning. Lamentations chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and share mercy daily. Share this film with every family who has buried someone they loved. Visit us every day at www.mothersfaith.xyz. This film was created by Susanna Sunday, a mother's journey of faith, autism, and self-discovery. Copyright 2026, Susanna Sunday. All rights reserved.